Hello, my name is Philip Opt. I worked at SIF between 2011 and 2015, where I carried out my research at Aldabra Atoll, um, which I then used in my PhD. My PhD investigated the associations between reef fish and the benthic habitats at Aldabra Atoll. The thesis was made of 7 chapters, and I'm briefly going to talk about the 5 research chapters here. So in the second chapter, we investigated the reefs and their distribution around Aldabra Atoll. We used satellite imagery of the atoll to map the different habitat types. We collected ground truthing data from 321 video transects around the atoll between 0 and 60 meters depth, which we then put through image classification techniques to derive, firstly, a habitat classification scheme, which we then applied to derive a habitat map. This habitat map here shows the 6 major broad scale categories that we mapped. We also repeated this at a much finer scale to derive 12 categories, which I'm not going to go into any great detail about here, but they are available in the thesis. In the third chapter, we looked at the effect of depth and wave exposure to predict the probability of occurrence of these benthic habitats around the atoll. From the map here, you can see that wave exposure was greatest in the east and in the south of the atoll, and the leeward north and western side are relatively sheltered. We could then use this to look at the probability of occurrence of the different habitat types, which we mapped in the first chapter. And this graph here, we're looking at 10 meters depth for all of them on the different sides of the atoll, north, east, south, and west. And the graph is showing on the x-axis an increase in wave exposure for each one of these aspects. And it was showing that the peak probability of occurrence for hard coral tended to be where there was medium levels of wave exposure, so around those sort of values. Whereas on the more exposed sides, you can see as soon as the sampling sites were more exposed, the probability of occurrence of hard coral just dropped straight away. And we can use this to predict the probability that we'd find any kind of habitat around the atoll and indeed in nearby atolls. In the fourth chapter, we looked at the differences in the fish assemblage at Aldabra when we sampled them using baited remote underwater video systems compared to unbaited remote underwater video systems. We did this because we know that BRUV is a very good way of surveying large mobile predators like sharks and rays. But we don't know how their presence is affecting the rest of the fish community which we sample. Now, Aldabra provided an ideal opportunity to do this, given that its fish assemblages are relatively pristine. The results showed that, as we expected, generalist carnivores and piscivores were significantly more in baited samples relative to the unbaited ones. And they were also more diverse. But what our results showed here, which has not previously been shown, is that both herbivores and corallivores were significantly more abundant and diverse in unbaited treatments than they were in baited treatments. This has implications for how we use the survey techniques. BRUVs is therefore really good at standardizing surveys so that they're insensitive to environmental variability, and they're therefore very good to record fish assemblages over any length of time, where unbaited remote underwater video systems are better when we want to look at ecological studies, so how environmental variables are affecting the fish assemblage. In the fifth chapter, we looked at the effect of tide and time of day on the fish assemblage. And we sampled the fish assemblage in the early morning, high tide, midday, low tide, and again at the evening, high tide, over the course of a spring tide. And we repeated this a number of times. From that data, it was shown that fish assemblages that were sampled during the high tide in the early mornings and during the high tide in the evenings were more similar to each other than they were to the fish assemblages during any other time of the day. And you can see this on the graph by how they are grouping together. And how they group together is determined by what the species were and how many of them there were. The other interesting thing that was shown in this result is the significant differences were primarily detected when we used unbaited samples and not when we were using baited samples. And this agrees with the findings of the previous chapter that the presence of bait overrides the effects of other environmental variables. Fish are opportunistic and would transgress their natural sort of behaviors in the presence of bait. In the sixth chapter, we looked at the fish assemblages associations with habitat across a number of the habitat scales. So we looked at the broadest scale, geomorphic reef zones, which it was shown that the fish that were sampled in the same habitat zones tended to be more similar to each other than those that were sampled in further away habitat types. And indeed, this was the same for all the different scales at which we looked at. On here, I'm showing an increase in the complexity of the habitat which we mapped. And this was indeed true for all the scales. Then looked at the relationship between the size of bony fish and the size of the size of sharks in relation to their associations with habitat. And it was consistently shown that sharks had very little association with a particular habitat type, both in baited and unbaited samples, where bony fish were consistently most accurately predicted within fine-scale habitat classifications. The implications of this is, in order to conserve tropical reef fish, we need to ensure that we have a representative subsample of the different types of habitats. So we do not need to preserve the entire atoll to preserve reef fish, but we need to ensure that we have a representation of all the different habitat types. Whereas sharks, on the other hand, we need to ensure we've got the entire atoll conserved. And indeed, the habitats are likely to extend beyond the atoll, and we need to think about conserving nearby atolls such as Astove, Cosmolido, and Assumption to ensure Aldabra's reef sharks are protected. The outcomes of the thesis were really important as an evidence base which facilitated the expansion of the Aldabra Marine Protected Area, which was proclaimed earlier last year. The data also used to guide the Aldabra site management plan. With this, I'd like to conclude and say thanks very much to all the wonderful staff and the board from SIF and all those involved in the study for the wonderful opportunity and your assistance with my research at Aldabra Atoll. Thanks very much.